All right, welcome back. We're going to look now at the third series, the second stage, uh, series of visions, of which there will be 6. Okay, so in the last stage, we saw this idea of the union with the mind, which is the recognition of the fundamental ambivalence at the bottom of the collective unconscious. The second stage is a movement towards the a movement towards the embodiment of that ambivalence into sort of our interactions with the world and in behaviors. So Jung says this is making a reality of the person who's acquired some knowledge of his wholeness. Right? So we've got some idea of what it means to be ambivalent and whole, but we are not quite sure perhaps how to make that happen in the world. So here's the first vision. The Indian saw a man baptizing himself in the water below. The Indian entered the town. A great crowd was gathered and shot arrows at him. An arrow hit him in the left leg below the knee. He pulled it out and blood flowed. He left the city and went alone to a high hill where he wept because he'd been lamed. So the first we notice the intellect is sort of walking along and sees this sort of premonition of what's to come, this baptism, this initiation into the body. And he continues walking, keep moving, and he encounters this town, so a group. He returns, the intellect sort of returns, having had this profound revelation, the intellect now returns to the social world. But in that return, he's still met with the same projections as before. So something may have changed in the intellect, but the wider world, nothing has really changed in the wider world. So the arrows tend to represent, in this sort of Jungian world, projection, and so he's still being hit by these projections, and they're still quite wounding to him. So he hasn't really translated this revelation into lived experience. I might also note that the idea of blood flowing has both to do with this woundedness, but it's also sort of the notion of the lifeblood of the social world is projection and projective identification. It would be quite difficult to see how anything would get done at all if we weren't doing this sort of projecting process. Okay, but the intellect, sort of quite dismayed that this still exists and he's still wounded, leaves in order to retreat to a place where he can be alone. He then rode away over the plain in the direction of the sun till he came to an Indian village where he dismounted. The Indians said, "Lo, he's returned to us." Then all the animals came forth from the wood, and shoals of fish cast themselves upon the dry land. So the intellect sort of leaves, but follows this compass, this inner guide, the sun, till he comes back, we might think, to himself, to a place where he is surrounded by sort of that which with he's familiar, maybe internally, and he's able to dismount and to rest. And he's sort of welcomed, we might think, by the psyche. I think he's retreated now back to the psyche. And the instincts are there, sort of making him comfortable. And there's also this plentiful spiritual nourishment in the form of these fish. So the bull is back and picks up an infant from the ground and carries him to a Greek temple. Through a hole in the roof streamed a ray of sunlight. This ray of light struck the child on the forehead, imprinting a star there. So this image to the intellect sort of retreats, and this image of totality is back. And the psychological totality has something that it needs to do with this inner child that we met previously. So this inner innocence, this undeveloped innocence, is sort of undergoes this, we might think, ritual or rite, though it's sort of in seclusion, and it's elected or anointed for something. It has some purpose to accomplish this idea of being sort of hit on the forehead with a ray of light, this sort of picking out, making special this child. So the boy leaped into the water, came to a cave where there were 3 witches. He tore the tooth from the mouth of one of the witches and ran from the cave. Then he was attacked by fierce wild animals until he was bleeding from many wounds. So the infant has grown up a bit, it's now a boy, and it's sort of able to navigate the waters of the unconscious, we might think, until it encounters again the same sort of evil that the intellect had maybe feared initially, represented by these witches. And the natural disposition of this inner child, this sort of naive child, is to try to rob evil of its essence or to take the teeth out of evil. And this doesn't work. He tries to sort of fix evil, to correct it, but this is met with this sort of overwhelming opposition of the instincts and maybe the sort of natural world generally. So a circle of fire descended and burned in a flaming circle around the youth. Then the youth said, "I am the sacrifice," and the fire consumed him. A white bird issued from his breast and flew up beyond the reaches of the flames. So this child, sort of representing psychological naivete, is not able to accomplish this, naive idealization of what to do with evil, and so it's quite consumed, we might think, by this fire, by the fire of passions, maybe. And the youth is then sort of gives itself over. This naive instinct or impulse gives itself over to a sort of recognition that it can't do what it wants to do. It needs to give itself up. The naivete needs to give itself up. And in that recognition of the need to sacrifice the naive outlook towards evil, there's the spiritual principle that is issued and sort of leads one into the future in a sense. This sort of this peace, maybe spiritual peace, that will lead one into the future. So finally, I beheld a satyr. He put a blue robe upon me and pearls around my neck. I knelt before him. Then he spoke to me, saying, I am the immortal one, I am the past, I am also the future. You shall know me. He made the sign of the cross upon my face and breast. So the first thing to notice is this idea of a satyr is this sort of ancient god, which is both goat and man, representing, we might think, the embodied ambivalence of sort of erotic interest, maybe shadow qualities, and sort of light qualities of spirituality, civilization that accompanies the human being. And so this ambivalence has somehow now come into the body in ways that I will discuss in the next slide. But there's this process then of the ego, we might think, being ordained or anointed in some way by this embodied principle of ambivalence. And this principle of ambivalence is saying that, I am sort of the past and the future. I transcend, in some sense, time. I am the embodiment of ambivalence. Okay, so what I want to say then about this final stage of the second stage of the embodiment of ambivalence. We noted previously it's the idea of making a reality of the person who's acquired knowledge of wholeness. So previously we sort of recognized why we suffer. It's the attribution of goodness or evil in totality to ourselves or to others, and this sort of revelation of the fundamental ambivalence of life allows us to break free of that sort of idealization. In the second stage, we see the attempt to bring that into the world being met by projection, a sort of need to retreat from the social world, to give up our idealizations of good and evil. And in this sort of iterative process of going into the world, being disappointed in some way or being hurt in some way, retreating, and then giving up the idealizations that sort of cause the suffering, the notion is this brings about the embodiment of ambivalence. Okay, so let's take another 5 minutes to go through, select one of these images. Like I've done previously, I think if you're sort of ambitious, you might think, what are the projections that have harmed me? Although I would caution that this isn't necessarily the space for that. It may be more interesting to think of some of the latter things. We don't have the space to sort of be a container for this to a very large degree, so it may be safer to sort of think of what would it be like to be anointed by this satyr god, to feel the embodiment of ambivalence. I think that's a safe bet. You may consider working with sort of the anointing of the child. It depends on sort of where you're at. Or you could consider sort of this white bird. I think it's probably a safe one too.